Emma Reed, a quiet soul, had never put stock in the idea of destiny. She subscribed to a different philosophy: stay under the radar, work relentlessly, and simply make it through each day without attracting undue attention. However, one blistering Tuesday morning, as she paused to adjust her shirt in the reflection of a sleek black car's window, little did she know that someone was silently observing her from the other side, a person who would soon shatter everything she thought she knew about herself, about the kind of life she truly deserved. With her head slightly bowed, Emma Reed walked through the sunlit streets. The past seemed woven into her every movement, as though it rested heavily on her shoulders. The sun, already high in the sky, cast long shadows across the pavement, flickering off rows of parked cars. Her jeans were frayed at the knees, and her faded tank top clung to her, an awkward choice for the early summer heat. She wasn't heading anywhere special, just to the diner where she worked the morning shift, but she still made an effort to look somewhat decent. As she walked, she paused by a pristine black car parked at the corner. It gleamed under the sunlight, an expensive luxury model, the kind of car that seemed out of place in this neighborhood. Its tinted windows mirrored her, and without thinking, she stepped closer, adjusting the strap of her tank top that stubbornly slid off her shoulder. She caught a glimpse of her reflection: disheveled ponytail, faint dark circles under her eyes, and bare skin. No makeup. She quickly adjusted her shirt, her fingers brushing against the fabric as her gaze briefly met her own eyes. Without a second thought, she moved on, walking away. What she didn't notice was the man sitting quietly inside the car, just beyond the tinted glass. Edward Montgomery had been parked there for a while, his engine switched off, his phone laying face down on the seat next to him. He had no business being here, no meetings planned, no clear reason to be driving through this part of the city. But there was something about being away from the polished marble floors and shiny glass elevators of his world, something that made the air feel a little easier to breathe. That morning, without any particular intention, he had parked and simply tried to clear his mind. And then she walked by. He observed how she didn't glance around to see who was in the car. She didn't pose or try to appear any certain way. She didn't seem to realize how effortlessly beautiful she was. There was a raw honesty in the way she studied her own reflection, almost as if she didn't even recognize the person staring back. That vulnerability struck him deeply. He had encountered women adorned in diamonds and silk, women who knew exactly how to capture his attention. But this girl, with her worn jeans and tired eyes, held his gaze without even trying. By the time Emma was out of his sight, Edward remained seated, unmoving, lost in thoughts he couldn't yet label. He didn't know who she was or why she seemed so important. But something had shifted inside him, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel numb. Emma's life was a steady march of routine. Aged 30, she brewed a pot of cheap coffee, tied her hair back without ever glancing in the mirror, and walked the same cracked sidewalk to the diner 6 blocks away. The diner was an old building, its sign missing several letters, and the air always carried the smell of burnt toast, even after hours. But it was a job, a small, stable anchor in her otherwise uncertain life. She had been there for almost 2 years, ever since she aged out of the foster care system. It wasn't glamorous. She wiped down sticky tables, refilled chipped mugs with lukewarm coffee, and kept quiet when customers called her sweetheart like it was her name. After her shift, she often took the bus across town to a cramped community college, slowly, painfully working toward a nursing degree. Some nights, she fell asleep on the bus and missed her stop. Some nights, she sat through class with sore feet and an empty stomach. But she kept going, not because she believed in fairy tales, but because doing nothing seemed far worse. Her past was a shadow she couldn't escape. Her mother had overdosed when Emma was 13, lying lifeless on the floor of their cramped apartment, shared with 2 other families. She still remembered the frantic attempt to call for help, her hands shaking uncontrollably, too nervous to dial. After that came the foster homes, the temporary shelters, the well-meaning but detached counselors, and foster parents more interested in the paycheck than her well-being. Trust was a foreign concept to Emma. In fact, she didn't trust anyone. So, When she noticed the same sleek black car passing by the diner twice in one morning, a sense of unease gnawed at her. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, maybe some lost businessman. But when the car showed up again later that afternoon, parked across the street while she was taking the trash out back, her instincts kicked in. She knew what it felt like to be watched, even if she couldn't fathom why someone would be watching her now. She didn't speak to anyone at the diner. She never did. Instead, she tightened her ponytail, pulled her hoodie tighter around herself, and reminded herself to stay alert. Her world had no room for surprises or magical encounters with happy endings. From her experience, when people appeared in your life, it was always because they wanted something. And no one wanted something without expecting a cost. So she kept her head down, her steps measured, and her heart carefully locked away where no one could reach it. Even if someone was watching her, even if something was about to change, Emma knew that hope was a dangerous thing. It made you weak, and weakness didn't survive. Edward had never been one to obsess over strangers. His life was all about efficiency, control, and distraction, endless meetings, social circles that were curated to perfection, phone calls timed down to the second, and appearances that were always meticulously managed. But something about that girl, the way she looked at her reflection like it was her only mirror, carved a space in his mind that he couldn't ignore. He found himself returning to that block. Not every day at first, but enough that he couldn't quite explain to himself why he kept coming back. He told his assistant he needed a break from work, claiming he was researching investment opportunities in urban renewal projects, something he didn't even believe in. He didn't want to admit what the real reason was, not even to himself. Each time he drove past that diner, he justified it as curiosity. But deep down, he knew better. He wasn't watching the neighborhood. He was watching her. One afternoon, he sat parked just down the block, the car humming quietly. The windows were dark enough to shield him, but he could still see her through the glass. She stepped outside in her uniform, plain black pants, a faded shirt with a name tag, and hauled 2 heavy trash bags toward the alley behind the diner. He noticed how she moved, as though she was used to doing everything on her own, as if no one had ever offered to help. There was something heartbreakingly ordinary about her. And yet, in that ordinariness, he saw something extraordinary. She wasn't trying to stand out, but that was precisely what made her unforgettable. He asked his driver, Marcus, to find out who she was. Marcus didn't question it. In all their years together, Edward had never made a request like this, and Marcus understood without words that this wasn't about business. The next day, Marcus handed him a small file, her name, her workplace, and a brief background check. Edward was surprised to learn how little there was. No known family, a few foster homes, a part-time student, a clean record, a quiet existence. He could have sent someone to speak with her, arranged some indirect approach, but he didn't want to play games. That wasn't his intention. Instead, he decided to go to the diner. The first time, he sat in the back corner, ordering only black coffee. She didn't even acknowledge him. She refilled his cup, cleared his plate, wiped down a neighboring table, all without saying a word. Still, he stayed. He came back the next day, and the next, always sitting at the same table, always ordering the same coffee. He watched how she dealt with rude customers in silence, how she showed quiet kindness to an elderly regular, how she moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being invisible. By the 4th visit, he found himself waiting for her to look at him, to acknowledge him in some small way. But she never did. Oddly, that only drew him closer. She wasn't impressed. She wasn't curious. She didn't care who he was or why he kept showing up. What he didn't realize was that Emma had noticed him the very first time he walked through that door. She saw everything. She just didn't react. Reacting meant opening up, and she had stopped opening doors long ago. She had no idea who he was, but something about him unsettled her. He was too polished, too clean, too out of place. And yet, there was something painfully familiar about the way he watched her, as though he was searching for something he had already lost. Neither of them realized it yet, but something irreversible had already begun. On the 5th day, Emma couldn't ignore it anymore. The same man. The same table. The same silent glances. It was starting to gnaw at her. She wasn't easily rattled, not after everything she had been through, but this felt different. He wasn't creepy. He wasn't pushy. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But maybe that was what made it worse. He was always there, a quiet observer, never a word escaping his lips. Carrying the coffee pot, she approached his table, topping off his half-full cup without needing to ask. Her voice was even, unbothered, but her gaze was sharp when she finally broke the silence. "Did you lose something here?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "You've been in the same seat for 5 days straight." He raised his eyes slowly, a small smile curving his lips, but the look in his eyes didn't match it. There was something deep in them, something silent, searching. "Maybe," he said, his voice low. "Maybe I found it." Emma rolled her eyes, turning to walk away, but something in the way he said it, soft, sincere, not flirtatious, paused her steps. She glanced back, almost unwillingly. He didn't follow her, didn't try to speak again. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, turning his attention back to the window, like he was waiting for something that had no name. Later, during her 10-minute break, she stepped outside and found him leaning against the wall by the diner's entrance. No coffee, no phone, no reason. It seemed he just stood there, hands in pockets, that same unbroken expression on his face. "I'm not here to bother you," he said, before she could speak. I like talking to you, even if it's only for a sentence." Emma crossed her arms, skeptical. "You don't know me." "No," he admitted, "but I'd like to." She shook her head, more exasperated than intrigued. "That line probably works better wherever you come from." "I didn't mean it as a line," he said, his voice steady, unrefined. "I meant it exactly the way I said it." She studied him for a long moment, unsure whether he was out of his mind or just stubborn. He didn't look like a liar, though. He didn't look like anything in particular, just a man who didn't seem to belong inside the skin he wore. "Look," he said, stepping back a bit. "No pressure. No games. Just, if you ever want to get some air, I know a place nearby that has better coffee than this." Emma arched an eyebrow. "You've been drinking this coffee all week." He smiled, a smile that seemed more genuine than before. Exactly. That night, she didn't go with him. But the thought lingered. And the next day, when he appeared again, just nodding at her without expectation, something fluttered inside her, a sensation she hadn't felt in years, something resembling curiosity. By the third time he asked, she said yes. Not because she trusted him, or because she wanted anything from him, but because something deep inside whispered that maybe, just maybe, some doors didn't lead to pain. Some doors led to fresh air. Their first walk was quiet. Not the awkward silence that begged to be filled, but something more natural, like two people simply sharing space without feeling the need to explain why. They wandered through a nearby park, where the trees leaned over cracked sidewalks and weathered benches. Emma spoke little, and Edward didn't push. He seemed to understand without needing to be told. Pressure would only push her away. He walked beside her, hands in his pockets, glancing over occasionally, just to make sure she was still there. When she spoke, it wasn't small talk. She asked him what he did for a living, and he hesitated. For a moment, he thought about telling her the truth, that he was the CEO of Montgomery Holdings, that he sat at the head of boardrooms most people never saw. But there was something in her eyes that made him take a different path. "I used to run a company," he said carefully. "Right now, I'm trying to remember who I was before that." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Emma didn't seem surprised or curious. She simply nodded, like she understood what it was to lose pieces of yourself along the way. In the weeks that followed, their walks became routine. They never planned them. He'd show up at the diner after her shift, standing outside silently, and if she felt like joining him, she would. If not, he would nod and leave. That was the deal. No pressure. No questions. Just presence. And during those walks, she began to open up. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like someone testing the weight of a locked box before handing over the key. She told him about the first night in a foster home, how she slept in her shoes, unsure whether she'd have to run. She told him how she read medical textbooks at the library because she couldn't afford internet or classes, how she once saved a neighbor from an overdose, and how that was the moment she realized she wanted to be a nurse. Her voice was calm when she spoke, as though she had long ago learned to handle pain like delicate glass, either gently or not at all. Edward listened more than he spoke. When he did, it wasn't about wealth or business. He talked about his brother, who died in a car crash when they were teenagers. He told her how their parents stopped looking at each other after that, and how the silence in their mansion was louder than any scream. He spoke of how success felt like climbing an endless mountain, each accomplishment leaving him emptier, not fuller. And he told her that, for the first time in years, this girl from nowhere, had made him feel something solid beneath his feet. There was no romance in those early days, no flirtation or touch. Just two people slowly unraveling their wounded histories beneath dim streetlights and quiet skies. But something deeper was growing. Something rooted in truth, not in fantasy. Emma didn't trust easily, and Edward didn't expect her to. But with every walk, every shared silence, and every honest word, the walls she had carefully built began to shift, if only slightly. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered if it was possible to be seen, not as a burden, not as a project, but simply as herself. It happened on a Thursday evening, when the air was thick with the promise of rain. They had walked farther than usual, eventually reaching a quiet overlook above the city, where the lights blinked like distant stars. Emma sat on a low concrete wall, her hands curled around a paper cup of tea he had bought from a street vendor. For the first time in weeks, she looked relaxed. Her shoulders weren't tense. Her eyes weren't scanning the horizon for threats. She looked peaceful, or at least close to it. Edward had been thinking about this moment for days. The truth pressed against him, a weight heavy in his chest. And every time he looked at her, it became harder to ignore. He had told himself to wait, that she wasn't ready to know. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. The longer he kept it from her, the more it would feel like betrayal. So, he took a breath and spoke, not with his usual confidence, but with quiet vulnerability. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, watching the way her eyes sharpened instantly. "Something important about who I am." Emma didn't move, but her posture shifted, subtle, defensive. She placed the cup beside her on the wall and crossed her arms, but didn't interrupt. "My name is Edward Montgomery," he continued. "I own a company, Montgomery Holdings. It's big. Probably the kind of company you've heard of, even if you don't know who runs it." The silence that followed was complete. Not a single breeze stirred the leaves. Emma didn't speak. She didn't blink. For a moment, he wondered if she was even breathing. She finally stood up, slow and deliberate, taking 2 steps back. Her face didn't show anger, not yet, but there was something harder in her eyes. Disappointment. Distance. "So, this was all just some kind of game?" she asked, her voice controlled. "You just decided to drop into my life because you were bored?" "No," he said quickly. "Emma, it wasn't like that." "Don't," she snapped, suddenly furious. "Don't say my name like you have the right to it." He tried to explain. He told her he hadn't planned any of it, that he hadn't expected to feel anything, that meeting her had changed him in ways he couldn't put into words. But she wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't even looking at him. Her hands shook, not with rage, but with the old, familiar instinct to run. "I let you in," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I don't do that. I don't let people in." "I know," he replied softly, "and I didn't want to lie." "But you did," she said, her voice now flat. "You watched me. You found out who I was without asking. That's not honesty. That's control." He reached out, not to grab her, but simply to be closer. But she stepped back again, and the look on her face made his chest tighten. "I thought you were someone like me," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "But you're just another rich guy playing with something you don't understand." And then, just like that, she was gone. She didn't turn around. She didn't give him the chance to follow. One moment, she was there, with the city lights stretching behind her. The next, there was only the paper cup sitting alone on the wall, growing cold as the darkness crept in. For weeks, Emma vanished. It wasn't just that she stopped responding to his texts or ignored his calls. She disappeared entirely. The number she had used was disconnected. Her social media accounts, what little there had been, were erased. She wasn't at the diner anymore, and when Edward asked the manager, all he got was a shrug and a simple, "She quit." No forwarding address. No explanation. She had wiped herself away, and she had done it with precision. At first, Edward tried to respect her choice. He had hurt her, even if he hadn't meant to, and she had every right to walk away. But each morning, he woke up hoping to see her name flash across his phone screen, and each night, he lay awake, wondering where she was. It wasn't guilt that haunted him. It was the absence. The silence she left behind rang louder than any argument they could have had. He went back to the street where they'd first crossed paths, where the cracked sidewalk met that reflective car window that had started it all. He parked nearby, just sat there, lost in thought, wondering how a moment so small had grown into something so enormous. He retraced their walks, stood at the corners where they'd paused, and sat on the same bench where she once shared her story about saving a neighbor. He played her words over in his mind, again and again, and the more he thought about them, the more he realized how much of her trust had been built on truth that he had unknowingly shattered. He wanted to write her a letter. Not a text. Not an email. Something slower. Something more tangible. So he did. Sitting at the kitchen table in his penthouse, a place that had never felt more empty, he picked up a pen like he hadn't in years. His handwriting was uneven. The words didn't come easily. But he didn't stop until the page was filled. He didn't ask her to come back. He didn't make promises. He just laid out the truth, everything he hadn't said when he had the chance. That at first, he'd watched her because he didn't understand what he was feeling. That he'd lied by omission and regretted it every day since. That meeting her had been the only thing in his life that had felt real, unscripted, and if she never forgave him, he would still carry the version of himself she had helped him discover. He mailed the letter to the only place he could think of, the rundown apartment complex across town where Marcus had once tracked down her roommate's name. There was no guarantee she'd get it. No way to know if it would even reach her. But it was the last thread he had to hold on to. Days passed. Then a week. Then another. No response. No sign. Then, one evening, just as the sun began slipping behind the skyline, Edward returned to the place where it had all started, the sidewalk where she had once adjusted her tank top in the car's reflection, never knowing he was watching. He sat on a nearby bench, hands folded in his lap. No expectations. Just presence. She wasn't there. He stayed until the streetlights flickered to life and the shadows stretched long across the pavement. He was about to leave when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He didn't turn immediately. He didn't want to allow himself to hope too quickly. Then came her voice, steady but soft. "I got your letter." He stood slowly, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She was there, just a few feet away, her hoodie pulled up around her face like armor. Her eyes were unreadable, but she hadn't run. Not yet. "I didn't know if I should come," she said, her voice quiet. "But—" She paused, looking down at the ground before meeting his gaze again. "I didn't want to disappear forever, either." He nodded. "I'm glad you didn't." They stood there for a long moment, both of them silent. Then she took a small step closer just once, and it was enough. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for her. He simply waited, the same way he had when they'd first started walking side by side. And then, without a word, she sat down next to him on the bench, wrapping her arms around her knees. For now, that was enough. A year later, the city felt different. Maybe it was the same cracked sidewalks, the same flickering streetlights, the same rusted fire escapes and distant sirens. But to Emma, everything seemed lighter, as though the very air had shifted. She walked down streets she once dreaded, her step steadier than she had ever thought possible. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled from a long shift at the clinic, but there was a quiet pride in the way she wore them. The name tag on her chest now read Emma Reed, RN, and every time she caught sight of it, even accidentally, a small piece of her healed. The clinic stood on a corner that had once been filled with abandoned buildings and empty storefronts. Now, children played on the sidewalks while their parents lingered nearby, some waiting for free checkups, others simply stopping by to chat. Inside, the walls were warm, a far cry from the sterile whites of other medical offices. The staff called each other by their first names. It wasn't just a clinic. It was a place built on second chances. Edward had sold a portion of Montgomery Holdings to fund the entire operation. It hadn't been a grand gesture or an attempt to prove anything. He'd done it because he believed in what she wanted to do, and because he no longer felt tethered to the idea that success had to mean skyscrapers and stock tickers. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt like a tool instead of a mask. Their relationship hadn't been perfect. There had been arguments, long nights of doubt, and days when silence hung between them like an unasked question. But there had also been growth, apologies that mattered, and trust that had been earned in slow, deliberate layers. Emma still carried her instincts, her wariness, but she no longer lived in survival mode. And Edward had learned how to listen not just here. They met each other where they were, not in perfection but in progress. They never made a big announcement. There was no dramatic proposal, no diamond ring in a velvet box. One night, curled up on the couch with takeout and a documentary playing in the background, Emma looked over at him and said, "I'm not going anywhere, you know." He smiled, leaning in close, and whispered, "Good, because I'd have followed you anywhere." Sometimes, they passed the place where she had once used his car window as a mirror. The building hadn't changed, but every time they passed, Emma would glance at that spot and shake her head with a soft laugh. "I was just fixing my shirt," she'd say, smiling at the absurdity of it all. "And I was just sitting there, avoiding my life," he'd reply. That mirror had better timing than either of us. They didn't need to pretend everything had been easy. The beauty of their story wasn't in its perfection, but in how real it had become. They came from different worlds, carried different wounds, and met in the most unexpected way. But somehow, against all odds, they had built something strong, something neither of them had ever dared to hope for. And sometimes, when Emma caught her reflection in a window, she no longer saw the girl who once flinched at her own gaze. She saw someone steady, someone loved, someone who had finally come home. To me, the beauty of this ending lies in its quietness. It doesn't shout with fairy tale perfection or fireworks, and that's exactly why it feels real. Emma and Edward's story isn't about rescue. It's about recognition. Two people from wildly different worlds saw past surface and status, past fear and pride, into the parts of each other that had been overlooked and wounded for too long. What makes this ending powerful isn't that they ended up together, but how they did. Through slow forgiveness, uncomfortable truths, and the terrifying act of choosing vulnerability after years of building walls. Emma didn't fall into luxury, and Edward didn't abandon his world. They both changed, not for each other, but because of each other. It's a love story, yes, but not the kind where everything is magically fixed. It's the kind where everything is faced, and in that facing, it becomes something far more lasting.